A lot of people assume being broke is only about how much money you earn. But in reality, for most people, it has very little to do with income alone and far more to do with patterns that repeat quietly in the background of everyday life. Patterns so normal that they don't even feel like financial decisions anymore. They feel like routine, comfort, or just survival. And that is where the real system begins.
Before we begin, let me ask you something. Have you ever gotten paid, felt relieved for a moment, and then wondered where all the money went just a few weeks later? I'm Gabby, and in this video, I'm going to explain why so many people feel financially stuck, not because they don't work hard, but because of hidden habits and psychological patterns most people never notice. If you enjoy content about money, financial psychology, and how the economic system really works, make sure you like this video and hit the subscribe button. Now, let's get into it.
It often starts in a very familiar way. Maybe a morning where you check your account balance and already know the rough number you are going to see. Or a moment in the store where you calculate prices in your head before even picking things up. Or that quiet mental adjustment where you start removing items before reaching the checkout because you already know what your money can or cannot handle. And over time, this becomes so normal that it stops feeling like restriction and starts feeling like identity.
What most people never notice is that this is not just personal behavior. It is a behavioral loop, a repeating cycle where decisions are influenced less by logic and more by emotional memory, habit, and environment. And once this loop stabilizes, it begins to reproduce the same financial outcomes again and again, even when opportunities or income slightly change. To understand this properly, imagine two people earning completely different amounts of money, but living under similar behavioral patterns. Both of them reacting the same way to spending decisions. Both of them avoiding financial planning when stressed. Both of them making emotional purchases after difficult days. And both of them delaying financial organization because it feels uncomfortable. In that situation, the income difference becomes less important than the psychological structure guiding their choices.
This is why many people stay in the same financial position for years, without realizing that the real limitation is not just external, but internalized behavior, a system of reactions that becomes automatic over time. And the longer it runs, the more invisible it becomes. The core of this loop is simple but powerful. Income comes in, expenses adjust upward to match emotional needs, unexpected costs reduce savings intention, and then the cycle resets with the belief that next month will be better. But next month follows the same structure, just with slightly different numbers. And because the changes are small, the pattern feels stable, even when it is not improving.
Psychologically, the brain is not designed to track long-term financial drift. It is designed to respond to immediate reward, immediate stress, and immediate relief, which means that spending decisions are often emotional responses, dressed up as practical choices, and saving decisions are often delayed intentions that never fully enter action. Over time, this creates what can be described as financial autopilot, where a person is no longer actively deciding their financial path in each moment, but instead following pre-established emotional scripts, such as spending to reduce stress, avoiding budgeting because it feels restrictive, or ignoring financial planning because it feels overwhelming.
At a systemic level, this is reinforced by the environment itself, because modern economies are built around constant consumption triggers, from digital payments that remove the physical feeling of spending, to marketing systems that personalize desire, to subscription models that distribute costs in small, invisible fragments, all of which reduce friction between impulse and action. And when friction is reduced, behavior becomes easier to repeat. This is where the loop strengthens, because each repeated action reinforces the next one, and the brain begins to treat the pattern as normal, even when the outcome is not desirable. And that normalization is what makes financial stagnation so difficult to detect from the inside.
One of the most important shifts in understanding this system is realizing that most financial struggles are not caused by a single big mistake, but by many small, consistent ones that never appear significant individually, but accumulate over time into a stable pattern of limitation.
For example, small daily spending decisions that feel irrelevant in isolation can form a significant monthly impact, but because they are spread across time and emotional states, they do not register as a single coherent financial behavior. They register as life happening normally. At the same time, irregular income or unpredictable expenses can make it even harder to build structure, because the brain starts associating financial planning with instability rather than control, which reinforces avoidance. And avoidance then reinforces instability, completing another layer of the loop.
There is also a deeper psychological mechanism at play, which is the adaptation to financial conditions, meaning that people tend to adjust their expectations based on what they currently experience, not what is theoretically possible. So if someone is consistently living near their financial limit, that limit begins to feel like the natural baseline. This is why, even when income increases slightly, the improvement often feels temporary, because expenses and expectations quickly adjust to absorb the difference, and the person returns to the same emotional experience of limitation, just at a slightly higher numerical level. The loop continues because it is self-stabilizing, not because it is forced from the outside, but because each part of it supports the next part, and without interruption, it can persist for years without dramatic change.
Breaking this pattern is not about sudden transformation. It is about awareness of structure. Because once the structure becomes visible, the behavior stops feeling like identity and starts feeling like a system that can be adjusted. And that is a critical shift, because most people interpret their financial situation as a reflection of who they are, rather than what they repeatedly do. And that misunderstanding makes change feel personal and difficult instead of mechanical and possible. When you begin to separate identity from behavior, you start to see that financial outcomes are not fixed traits, but results of repeated decisions operating under specific conditions.
From this perspective, the goal is not to fight every individual decision, but to understand the loop itself, where it starts, what reinforces it, and what breaks it. Because systems do not change through pressure alone. They change through redesign. One of the strongest reinforcing points in the loop is emotional spending, which often appears after stress, fatigue, or mental overload. And in those moments, spending is not about value. It is about emotional regulation, a way to temporarily shift internal state through external action. Another reinforcing point is financial avoidance, where planning, budgeting, or reviewing expenses feels uncomfortable, so it is delayed. But that delay increases uncertainty, and uncertainty increases stress, which then increases emotional spending, again reinforcing the cycle. There is also a social layer to this system, where spending patterns are influenced by comparison, lifestyle exposure, and perceived normality, meaning that people often adjust their financial behavior based on what appears standard in their environment, even if that standard is not aligned with their financial reality.
This creates another invisible pressure, where financial decisions are not just personal, but socially influenced, and without awareness, it becomes easy to confuse external expectations with internal needs. When all these elements combine, emotional triggers, environmental reinforcement, adaptation, avoidance, and normalization, they form a closed loop that explains why many people feel like they are working constantly but not progressing financially. The important insight is that the loop is not permanent, but it is self-reinforcing, which means it continues only as long as it is not consciously interrupted. An interruption does not require drastic change, but consistent awareness of how decisions are being made in real time. Over time, even small moments of awareness begin to weaken the automatic nature of the loop, because once a behavior is noticed clearly, it becomes slightly less automatic the next time it appears, and that small gap between impulse and action is where change begins to form.
Zooming out, this entire system is not just about money, but about behavior under constraint. How humans adapt to limited resources, how they normalize patterns, and how those patterns become self-sustaining without conscious reinforcement. And in that sense, staying broke is rarely about a single cause, but about a structure of habits, emotions, and environment
that quietly align in the same direction over time. The most important realization is not that change requires more effort, but that change requires visibility. Because once the loop is seen clearly, it stops being invisible. And what stops being invisible can no longer control behavior in the same way.
From there, financial decisions begin to shift, not through force, but through understanding. And understanding is what slowly begins to break repetition. Not all at once, but step by step, through clearer awareness of what each decision is actually part of. And that is where the real shift begins. Not in income, not in luck, but in the recognition of the pattern itself. Because once the pattern is understood, it stops being destiny and starts becoming design.